My middle son is a senior in college. He's generally a good kid, but recently he asked me for money for a spring break trip to Hawaii with his friends, which caught me off guard. I want him to have fun, but something about his request annoyed me. His mother has been having mental health issues lately, so having him around would have meant a lot to her. But I suppose he's more interested in getting wasted on a beach with his fraternity brothers. I can't even assert that he is to blame for it. I was exactly the same when I was his age, and I recognize a lot of myself in that child. The entire experience actually made me think back on my own college days and reminded me of something I hadn't considered in a long time, which is the story I'm going to share. It's entertaining enough that my son brought me to this page, so perhaps he'll enjoy it. I attended Wharton class of 85, of which I'm still incredibly proud. It was and is the most prestigious business school in the world, and I took that reputation seriously. However, I also worked extremely hard. It was a different time in the past, and many of my classmates were as crazy as Wolf of Wall Street, and I tried my best to avoid becoming involved in that life. My junior year, though, I made a somewhat rash decision to date a Puerto Rican girl named Maria Muniz, whom I remember with fondness. Sometimes I try to think about how my life might have turned out if I had chosen to pursue relationships with other women, and she was one of them. Rather than returning home for spring break, as I usually did, Maria persuaded me to visit her extended family in Puerto Rico. I agreed without hesitation because it was my first time on the island and I wanted to impress her. I was a nervous wreck and didn't want to mess anything up, and Maria frequently made jokes about how open Puerto Rican families were, so I knew they already knew a lot about me. However, it turned out that my anxiety was mostly unfounded because I got along well with everyone when I met them and they seemed to really like me. Since it was spring break, we did have time for a few of our own trips, but the most of the trip was spent seeing her relatives. After all, one of those excursions involved hiking through Elgin, which is, incidentally, the only tropical rainforest in the US National Forest System. Since neither of us had a car, Maria's mother drove us and dropped us off at one of the most well-known trailheads. Since we were cunning, we definitely took advantage of the fact that we didn't have to drive. Our plan was to hike, enjoy the scenery, and sneak a little rum we'd packs. However, we soon discovered that there was a major issue. The trail we were most excited about was closed. I can't recall why it was due to flooding maintenance or something. Maria was really upset, so I tried to calm her down by telling her that we could just hike one of the many other trails the forest had to offer. She refused to budge, telling me that the trail we were going to hike was like the premier trail and the others weren't even close to how one hiking trail could be astronomically better than the other. I couldn't tell you though, because she was adamant, and I had long since learned the dangers of arguing with her over something like this. When she suggested that idea, I said that I was kind of rebellious back then, and she agreed. We had come this far, and now some rule was going to stop us, so there was no chance. She looked at me, and that was all it took. We made sure no one was around, slipped past the barriers, and began up the trail laughing like a couple of fools. At first, it was exactly what we wanted. Even better, because it felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves, which was especially awesome considering how popular this trail would have been otherwise. That kind of exclusivity is unattainable, but we hiked for a fair amount of time, passing small waterfalls and taking in the beauty of the forest. Yes, we were drinking, but not too much, just enough to get a good buzz. It was really enjoyable, I must admit, but then Maria suddenly screamed and leaped back, nearly toppling me. I was immediately on high alert, but I had no idea what had scared her, so I frantically searched the area until I spotted what appeared to be a freshly decapitated mongoose. Let me reiterate that it was a mongoose, a large one, and its head appeared to be missing entirely. I instructed Maria to remain in her current location and went alone to the carcass in the hopes that it might be a stuffed animal or something, but it wasn't. I examined it without getting too close and verified that, as I had initially believed, its head had been neatly sliced off, and the cut was too exact to be anything other than a knife wound, which was extremely unsettling. Maria was trembling, and I was mainly shocked by it. I tried to reassure her by saying something stupid like that crime in a national forest was unlikely, even though I couldn't explain it myself. The worst part, though, was that the body hadn't started to smell yet, meaning it probably hadn't been there for very long. We walked in silence for a while, and even though we separated ourselves from the mongoose, I could tell that the moment was gone because the adrenaline rush had worn off my buzz and erased my good mood as badly as I felt. However, I could tell that Maria was much more shaken, and I couldn't imagine that she was even enjoying herself in the slightest. I put my arm around her and ushered her past the body, trying to block it from the line of sight. As we were walking, I couldn't help but rack my brain trying to figure out what we had stumbled onto, because it didn't make any sense. But it was clear that she didn't want to stay in that forest anymore, and I couldn't blame her. I didn't know about the hunting regulations there, but I couldn't believe that it was legal to hunt in a national forest so near a pedestrian trail. Nevertheless, that was the only reason I could think of for leaving the mongoose body there to decay. Perhaps a hunter had taken advantage of the situation to have he had the entire forest to himself, just like we did. We hiked another mile or so, and I tried to cheer Maria up the entire time, but nothing worked. Eventually, she admitted that she wasn't feeling well and wanted to turn around. I didn't argue, but I was dreading having to pass that location again, mainly because I didn't know how it would affect her, and I just wanted her to feel comfortable. We retraced our steps, and I could tell we were getting close to where the mongoose had been. I told Maria to keep her head down so she wouldn't see, and she did. When we reached the last bend, however, the mongoose was gone. Someone had moved it. My heart began to race, and I immediately started looking around the trees, afraid that someone might be hiding among them. I was unprepared for what happened next, because instead of seeing a person, I saw a mongoose hanging from one of the trees. It was strung up with twine. Its paws were tied together, and it was rotating slowly in the wind with a sickly green liquid dripping from its body that had never been there before. I couldn't help but curse aloud when I saw it, which made Maria open her eyes. I grabbed her wrist and told her to run as soon as she saw it. Before she could freeze, she let out a terrible, blood-curdling scream of pure terror. We started running down the trail, trying not to trip over each other. I let her go ahead of me, and kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following us. But instead, a woman's scream rang out from somewhere behind us. It was a terrifying sound, like the kind of scream someone would make when they are attacked. I felt Maria's body jolt mid-stride, and for a moment, I thought she was going to collapse. She cried in panic and tried to push herself even harder, but she was already out of breath. I held onto her wrist almost like I was pulling her along, and as she slowed down, we were forced to keep going even though my own chest was burning. Eventually, Maria could barely run anymore, so we had to slow down to a fast walk. I turned around and began walking backward, keeping my eyes fixed on the trail behind us, bracing myself for a fight because I was positive that something had strung up that mongoose or caused that scream, but nothing ever happened. When the trail had finally appeared, I thought we were safe, but then I noticed a park employee standing close to the barricades, his arms crossed, obviously angry. As soon as we got past the barricades, he began yelling at us for breaking the rules and threatened to ban us for life. However, he got a good look at Maria, who was crying and physically exhausted at the time. I told the man everything, not omitting any details, and he took it very seriously, telling us that we both had to accompany him. So we did. When they phoned the police, I had to repeat the tale to a supervisor who was waiting at a small ranger station close to the parking lot. I never heard anything about what the authorities found or whether they even bothered to investigate. I'm sure Maria's family might have heard something, but we broke up the following summer and lost contact after that. So I really wouldn't know. I haven't thought about this experience in a long time, but it's still as unnerving as it was all those years ago. Maria didn't say anything until her mother finally arrived, and we left still shaking. Since we never saw anyone else on that route, and I have no idea who it belonged to, I believe that the scream was the worst part of the entire incident. I consider myself to be a really laid-back guy, and I would say the same about most of my friends. This happened last year, so I'll get right to the point. We arrived late, later than we had anticipated, and started walking toward the beach, which was dead quiet, with no other campers or fishermen, just empty sand stretching for miles. According to Isabel, spring break was supposed to be just me and my friends Jackson, Ariel, and Isabel camping on a secluded beach in Alabama. No crowds, just stars and waves. Who knew the area? Well, locals occasionally fish overnight on that section of the beach, but it was deserted that night. It wasn't quite dark yet, but the sun had already begun to drop, so we would need to quickly set up camp. Since I had driven, Jackson and I started setting up the tents. I had brought my dog, Bean, a Doberman who loved the sand, so we all enjoyed watching him run and roll around. At one point, Ariel pointed out a car in the distance and said it had passed by twice already. I turned and saw an old, dilapidated SUV slowly roll by on a narrow access road that ran parallel to the dunes. The beach where we were and a row of shrubs on the other side made it difficult to see the main roads from where we were. The access road was little more than a strip of packed sand that was only wide enough for one car. The car passed by and eventually vanished down the road, leaving the four of us behind. We dismissed it and resumed setting up. And when we were done, we decided to crack open some beers and cut it up in a circle. The females chose to drink seltzers rather than beer, which we ridiculed because it was getting close to nightfall. That car that had driven by was back again, but this time it stopped when it was parallel to us. The driver's door opened, and a man got out. I couldn't remember who saw it first, but he was very tall, and I couldn't make out any features of his face. He started to approach us, and the girls became anxious. After assuring them not to worry, Jackson and I got up to go stop the man before he could get to our tent. I invited Bean to accompany us since he was already on high alert. But as we drew nearer, I began to realize that when we got close enough, Jackson asked how things were going and tried to keep things light. The man didn't waste any time in saying, "You're on my property," but he slurred his words a little, so I assumed he was a little inebriated. He was also walking strangely, with a slight limp and several near falls. I informed him that we believed the beach to be public property and that it was highly improbable that a man owned it because there were no private signs. The man didn't respond, but instead produced a knife. In response to the man's body language, Bean began to growl, which, to be honest, should have scared the man away. How frightening the Doberman looked. Yet instead of moving, he began to run in our direction while brandishing his knife. I screamed at the top of my lungs. No, because I didn't want my dog to be stabbed. But Bean managed to get him to drop the knife. The man screamed in agony as Bean bit his arm, and I yelled for him to get off. He listened to me, ran back to my side, and kept his eyes on the man who was now writhing in agony on the ground. Eventually, the man got up and began running back towards his car, Jackson, and I hurried back to the girls to tell them everything. By the time we were done, the SUV had left, and the girls wanted to pack up and carry everything back to the car, but I was apprehensive about that plan, because I didn't want to walk in darkness with my hands full, and that guy was insane. I advised Ariel to phone the police and let them know where we were and what had happened. But Isabel was right when she said that he might come back with a pistol or something. The police were nearby, and the four of us began carrying our belongings to the parking lot. Bean was on high alert, and I must say that he was the only reason I felt even slightly safe. I was relieved when I saw lights ahead of my car, and I was not prepared for what happened next. He pointed out that my car's tires were slashed, and I was horrified to learn that they were. The officer unholstered his weapon and instructed me to unlock the car, which I did, opening my trunk, but thankfully it was a false alarm. Thank God we had been with us that night, because the police was kind enough to assist me with my tire dilemma. That man was most likely a drunken nut, and if he had gotten his way, it possibly could have resulted in a quadruple murder. It's great to discover a pleasant, quiet area to hang out, but there are risks involved, of course. My buddy Michelle and I planned a weekend trip to Miami over spring break in 2023. It was our first time there, and we were both 22. We stayed at a full house rental in Wynwood, which was about a 20-minute ride from the beach. We arrived on Thursday and planned to stay until Monday. We arrived at the airport rather late on Thursday, so we spent the first night out at some local bars. It was enjoyable. The next day, we took an Uber to Miami Beach for a beach day. We brought towels from the rental and just lay on the beach for hours. Several groups of guys approached us, but I think it was me in particular, who had this really charming accent and seemed like a nice, outgoing person. He introduced himself as well, asked what we were doing that night, and asked for my number. Later that day, after the beach and a few bars, we left Miami Beach because it was a little too crazy for us. Definitely because it was spring break, but it was just a bit too much. I gave it to him, and he seemed to be walking down the beach alone. We watched to see if he would stop and try to get more numbers, but he didn't. Instead, he just kept walking away, staring at his phone, and eventually walked off the beach in the direction of the street. Michelle was a little envious that he was showing me more attention. Around this time, I texted Wood to ask what he was doing for the evening. He replied quickly that he and his friend didn't have any plans yet, and then he suggested that the four of us go out in Wynwood. We drank in the backyard by the pool while listening to music on Michelle's speaker as we planned our evening. We arranged for Will and his friend to join us at the rental for pregame, so they arrived at around 8. The guy's name was Ken, and Michelle joked that the friend was cute, but I wasn't going to question that. He was also surprisingly attractive, and I could tell Michelle was pleasantly surprised. They brought their own drinks and left them on the kitchen counter, and we drank in the yard for about an hour. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until we finally walked to a nearby bar, which was also in Windward. I have to admit that Michelle and I were already intoxicated, and Ken and Will continued by rounds of shots. Things quickly became hazy. I wouldn't say I blacked out, but eventually bits and pieces of my memory became hazy. Will and I were alone ourselves for a while before I had to go to the restroom, but before I did, I recall him asking what I wanted for my next drink. When I returned from the restroom, I was shocked to discover Will hanging over the corner of the bar, obviously engaged in some shady activity. I responded with a tequila soda. He had the 2 drinks in front of him when I went in a particular manner to get a better view, but he was hovering over them as though he were adjusting my drink. I might have been intoxicated, but that was enough for my gut to urge me to go out. Without him noticing, I left the bar and went to the opposite side in search of Michelle. She and Ken were apparently gone, so I hurried out of there and tried calling her several times, but she never answered. This time, Will texted me to ask where I went, but I ignored it. I texted Michelle several times to find out where she was, and then I finally dropped the bomb, saying that I believe Will was trying to roof me and that we should leave these guys. I then started walking back to the Airbnb. I replied that he was hanging over the drink he had ordered for me, doing something to it, and Michelle wrote back, asking why she thought he was RFing you. Perhaps he was simply using his phone. I tried to call her again, but she didn't answer. Instead, she texted me back, saying, "I'm still with Ken." I replied that I had already left, so I wasn't going back anyhow, and I suggested that we meet at the Airbnb. She replied, "I'll be back soon," so I walked back. When I got there, I used the code lock to let myself in, and the door automatically locked after about 10 seconds. The same thing happened with the back door. In addition to being really concerned about Michelle, I felt as though I was overanalyzing the whole Ruthie situation. Perhaps he was simply using his phone, but it was too late, and I was shocked that he would never try to text or call me again. I sat there intoxicated and alone. The next thing I recall is the back doorknob jiggling, followed by the code lock's button sound effects and a failed attempt sound effect. Michelle then texted me to tell me to open the back door. When Michelle didn't answer when I shouted her name through the door at the back, I tried calling her phone, but she didn't answer either. I then received a text back saying, "Hurry, open the door, he's coming," which is when I started to become extremely panicked and yelled through the door. There was a peephole in the front door, so I rushed to the front and peeked through it. I felt terrible right now and was afraid for my life, because there were no windows or a peephole to check to see if it was indeed her. I begged Michelle to respond, but she never did. I saw what appeared to be Will hiding to the side of the front door. I was still too scared to open the back door without Michelle's confirmation that it was her, so I texted her back that I was calling 9191 right now. She didn't answer, so I called 911 and explained. While I was on the phone, I checked the peephole again, and Will wasn't there. When the police arrived, I let them in, and after 5 minutes, one of them asked if my friend was blonde, to which I replied that she was being brought here by another officer in their squad car. When she finally arrived in a second police car, I was both relieved and appalled. She had been crying uncontrollably and was as inebriated as she could be. She explained that her phone had been stolen, and that she had been lost for an hour on the streets until someone helped her call the police. All of the texts I received from her number were never from her. Instead, they were from that guy, Ken or whatever his real name was, and we also discovered her phone thrown in the backyard pool. They obviously removed it the moment I mentioned the police, so we had to file a police report, providing every last detail as precisely as possible. It was a long, terrifying night, and we had to contact the Airbnb host to cancel our stay and go somewhere else right away. The rest of our trip was obviously ruined, and it took a week before the police called to confirm the name that the guy I was texting gave me because it didn't match the phone records for that number, which I had already figured out was that he was using another stolen phone. After that, I never heard from them again, which is disgusting how little priority the police put into cases like this, even with simple evidence. Anna, my friend Lena, and I had been looking forward to spring break for weeks. We were broke college juniors desperate for a change of scenery, but neither of us could afford the traditional trip to Mexico or Hawaii, so we were kind of limited to somewhere in the continental United States, preferably not too far away. When we found a cheap Airbnb near Charleston's historic district, we booked it right away. After this terrible experience, I have no interest in going back to Miami. I could have honestly been killed. It was my first spring break after becoming 21, so I wouldn't have to worry about where others might steal, and it felt like just what we needed. My fake ID by the third night. We had established a routine of sightseeing during the day and going from restaurant to bar in the evening. Since neither Lena nor I drink a lot, we were enjoying the city's offerings more. Early that evening, we ended up at this little seafood restaurant that we had discovered online, serving fried shrimp, hush pui, and sweet tea. With that kind of ambience, the location truly seemed like a hidden gem, and though the positive vibe didn't last, I was impressed by Lena's ability to cut through all the touristy stuff to find something a little more genuine. However, halfway through our late lunch, my phone buzzed, and when I looked down, I saw a number I didn't recognize. I stared at it for a few seconds before showing Lena and asking her if she knew the number. She looked at my phone and said she didn't, so I assumed it was just a scam or something. But typically those scam texts say more than just, "Hey." Another text message from the same number appeared on my phone while I was laughing about something ridiculous. It read to look outside, which made me stop. I looked toward the window next to our table, expecting to see someone waving or playing with me. There was nothing but the street with people passing by as usual. Perhaps one of my school buddies had happened to travel to Charleston at the same time as us. I chuckled when I told Lena that someone was playing a practical joke on me, but the idea of it truly frightened me, because none of my friends were the kind to do that. I assumed it might have been a guy who had already made out with me and was bored or something. But a few minutes later, I received another message that said, "Anna, that message stopped me cold." If this person knew my name, it was definitely not a scam or a wrong number. I gasped and showed Lena, and she reminded me of something I had completely forgotten about on our first day in Charleston. Lena and I had entered one of those giveaways at a local cafe where they asked for your name, number, and a few other details. I had completely forgotten about it, but that was all I could think about when Lena brought it up. I hadn't given my number to anyone in Charleston either, so it made sense. I told Lena that whoever was texting me probably had her number as well, and the two of us kind of freaked each other out. Dinner wasn't as much fun after that. Honestly, I felt too out in the open. We paid the bill and decided to shake it off at a rooftop bar across town, which was packed and seemed to draw a younger crowd, so it was obvious. After a few drinks, I was beginning to relax, and Lena, naturally. That didn't last long because I received another message from that number saying, "That's a nice red jacket." I went rigid because I was wearing a red jacket. In fact, I was one of the only people there wearing red, and I looked around frantically, but it didn't help. The place was packed with people laughing and drinking, but nobody was looking at me, at least not clearly. I showed Lena the message, and she advised us to leave, so we started walking back to the Airbnb as carefully as we could, constantly checking behind us to make sure when we got inside. I bolted the door, double-checked all the locks, closed the curtains, and locked all the windows in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were overreacting. However, an hour after returning to the Airbnb, we started to get hungry, but neither of us wanted to leave, so we ordered Uber Eats instead, choosing a random burger place a few blocks away. I always had my Uber Eats setting to leave at the door by default, because I had a terrible experience with a delivery driver a while back that I didn't want to discuss, and the estimated wait time was 50 minutes, which felt like forever. For a short while, it helped to remove the residual paranoia from earlier. However, there was a knock at the door. I looked down at my phone and saw a notification from Uber Eats stating that the driver was arriving. I was perplexed, but typically Uber Eats would send a photo when the food was dropped off, so I wasn't entirely sure why our driver had knocked. I looked at Lena, and she seemed perplexed as well. I got up and checked the peephole, and sure enough, it was a random, large man wearing a hoodie carrying our food back. He appeared to be an ordinary Uber driver. After a few moments of waiting for him to put our food down and go, he simply stood there. After a while, he knocked on the door once more and said, "Uber Eats for Anna." I thanked him and told him to leave it outside, but he didn't move. There was a lengthy pause before he finally said that I needed to come out and sign something quickly that wasn't right. I gave Lena a knowing look, and she instantly took out her phone to dial 911, mouthing the number just in case. I wasn't going to argue with her because, in hindsight, it probably wasn't a good idea to speak to that person aloud, because he began knocking on the door more violently after that. He kept saying that he had other deliveries to make, and that he just needed a quick signature, but I knew that was bullshit. When I didn't answer, he began jiggling the doorknob, and when it didn't move, he began banging on the door while yelling my name. I honestly thought he was going to kick it down, and I doubt Lena and I could have stopped him if he had, But then I heard a siren in the distance, and the banging on the door stopped. I heard the food bag fall to the porch, and then quick footsteps running out of the house. Lena and I hurried to one of the windows just in time to see two officers tackling the man in a hoodie a few houses over when we heard sirens blaring and officers shouting. We were afraid to go outside, but we watched as they placed him in handcuffs and led him to the back of one of their cars. Fortunately, we were in a busy area. The officers then arrived at our house, and we told them everything, including the text I had been receiving. By some miracle, one of the officers had been patrolling just 2 blocks from our Airbnb when Lena made the call, which explained why they arrived so quickly. The cop's running theory was that he had followed us home from the bar and waited outside our house when the Uber Eats driver pulled up. He must have persuaded him to hand over the food, possibly posing as my boyfriend or something, and he had taken pictures of the giveaway forms. It turned out that our cafe theory was spot on. He worked there and had been following us since that afternoon, most likely because we had written down that we were only visiting for spring break, making us easy targets or something. The man also apparently had a criminal record, which made matters worse. We were dealing with someone who had a violent past, which was absolutely terrifying. The rest of the trip went poorly, and I was relieved when it was time to leave Charleston. I'm still not sure what that guy's plan was. Perhaps he believed that if we opened the door, he could force his way in and do whatever he wanted. In any case, I try not to consider what might have happened if Lena had called the police when she did, or even worse, if they hadn't arrived in time.